Captain Dana Wells had always been someone who could command a room. From the very first day she donned the police uniform, she knew the challenges she would face. Being both a black woman and a police officer had presented unique trials throughout her career, but she had weathered them with strength, determination, and grace. Over the years, she had risen through the ranks, not by playing politics or pulling strings, but by proving her competence, grit, and intelligence. Now, as a respected captain, she often had to remind herself of how far she'd come. Today, however, she wasn't wearing her uniform. She was just Dana Wells, an off-duty officer trying to enjoy a rare evening of normalcy. It was nearing dusk, and the sky outside was painted with hues of purple and orange. Dana loved this time of day, when the city seemed to exhale, transitioning from the chaos of day into the calm of evening. She had spent the last hour in a grocery store, a relatively mundane task, but one that she appreciated. It was a brief escape from the relentless pressure of her job. The small hum of the grocery store, the quiet banter between customers and cashiers, provided a welcome background to the thoughts swirling in her mind. She picked up a loaf of fresh sourdough bread from a local bakery and placed it into her basket, already thinking about the dinner she had planned for later that evening. In casual jeans and a simple gray sweatshirt, she moved with ease through the aisles, invisible to the world. Her badge and gun were safely tucked away in her purse, concealed beneath her arm. Though her job never really left her, Dana found comfort in moments like these, moments where she could blend into the crowd, just another face in a sea of people. After paying for her groceries, she walked toward the exit of the store, the cool air greeting her as the automatic doors slid open. The street outside was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. A couple of cyclists zoomed past her, and a group of teenagers laughed loudly as they walked by, animated in conversation. Dana smiled to herself, momentarily lost in the simple joy of the world around her. She slung her grocery bag over her shoulder and began the short walk back to her apartment. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from her partner asking when she'd be home. Dana quickly tapped a response. "On my way now, just grabbing groceries. See you in 10. It was a routine day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. About 2 blocks away, Officer Greg Mathers sat in his squad car, restless. The day had been uneventful so far, with only minor incidents, a traffic stop here, a noise complaint there. As an officer who prided himself on taking action, Greg found the quietness unnerving. He had joined the force to make a difference, to be in the middle of the action. He was still relatively young in his career, but his confidence in his abilities often led him to act on instinct. Sometimes those instincts were sharp, but other times they were clouded by assumptions he wasn't even fully aware of. The radio crackled to life. "Dispatch to all units. We have a 1031 in progress. Robbery suspect, black female, mid-30s, wearing dark jeans and a gray sweatshirt, last seen heading west on 5th and Maple." The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. Greg's eyes sharpened. He straightened up in his seat, adrenaline surging. "Unit 34, copy that," he responded quickly into the radio. "Heading toward 5th and Maple now." His heart raced and his hands tightened around the steering wheel. A robbery suspect fleeing the scene. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd been waiting for. His mind raced as he replayed the dispatch call in his head. Black female, mid-30s, dark jeans, gray sweatshirt. He could already feel the excitement of catching the suspect, of playing the role of the hero in tonight's shift. He made a sharp turn down Maple, scanning the streets for anyone who might match the description. And then he saw her. Dana Wells was casually walking down the street, a bag of groceries in her hand, her pace leisurely. She was minding her own business, completely unaware of the squad car that was slowly creeping up behind her. From Greg's perspective, it all made sense. She matched the description perfectly, Mid-30s, black, gray sweatshirt, dark jeans. He didn't give it a second thought. Greg's pulse quickened. His instincts screamed at him to act fast. He pulled over to the side of the road, his eyes never leaving the woman as she continued to walk, unaware of the tension building behind her. "Ma'am, stop right there!" Greg's voice rang out loud and authoritative, echoing off the buildings surrounding them. Dana stopped in her tracks, confused. The words hadn't quite registered yet. She turned around slowly, blinking against the bright headlights of the police cruiser, which now felt like two spotlights beaming directly at her. Her first instinct was that there must be some mistake. She had done nothing wrong. This had to be a misunderstanding. But the officer's posture, the tone of his voice, it all suggested something far more serious than a simple mix-up. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly, though there was a slight edge to her voice. Dana had been in situations like this before, not personally, but as an officer responding to scenes. Her experience told her that staying calm, maintaining control over her voice and body language, was key in diffusing tension. But Greg wasn't listening to her words. His mind was already made up. His pulse throbbed in his ears as he stepped closer, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered gun. The description from dispatch echoed in his mind, and the scene before him matched perfectly. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice sharp, his stance tense and ready for action. Dana frowned, the confusion deepening. She had dealt with tense situations before, but never one where she was the subject of suspicion. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she began, her voice still controlled, still trying to make sense of what was happening. But Greg wasn't hearing her. His eyes were locked on her, watching her every movement. His training kicked in, the voice in his head telling him to remain in control, to assume the worst-case scenario. He had made countless arrests before, many of them in situations just like this. His grip tightened on his holstered weapon as he repeated his command. "I said, hands where I can see them, now!" Dana's heartbeat quickened. She could feel the tension radiating off him, could sense the situation spiraling out of control. "I'm a police officer," she said, the firmness in her voice growing. "I'm Captain Dana Wells, from the 4th Precinct." But Greg was already too far gone. His perception had been clouded by the description, by his own preconceived notions of what danger looked like. In his mind, this was a suspect trying to lie her way out of an arrest. It was a story he had heard many times before, people trying to pretend they were someone they weren't, claiming to be innocent when they weren't. "Yeah, right," he muttered, barely processing her words as his hand moved toward his handcuffs. "I've heard it all before." Before Dana could react, Greg was on her, grabbing her arm and spinning her around with a force that startled her. Her purse fell to the ground, her groceries spilling across the sidewalk as he roughly pulled her hands behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, sending a surge of shock and anger through her. "Officer, this is a mistake," she protested, her voice rising in frustration as she struggled against the cuffs. "My badge is in my purse. I am Captain Dana Wells. You've got the wrong person." But Greg's tunnel vision had already kicked in. He was going through the motions of what he believed to be a standard arrest, following protocol in his mind. He had no time for excuses, no patience for what he thought were lies. With a firm grip on her arm, he led her toward the back of his squad car, ignoring the scattered groceries on the sidewalk, ignoring the anger building in her voice. Dana's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. How could this be happening? How could one of her own officers be treating her like this? She had spent years working alongside men like Greg, building trust, fostering camaraderie within the department. And yet, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. She was just another black woman in handcuffs, her identity, her rank, her years of service reduced to nothing. As Greg pushed her into the back seat of his squad car, the world around them seemed to pause. People on the street had begun to notice, some pulling out their phones to record the scene unfolding before them. To them, it looked like yet another arrest of a black woman by a white cop, a scene that had played out too many times in recent years, one that never failed to stir outrage and debate. Dana could feel their eyes on her, could feel the humiliation burning in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much larger, something much more painful and real. Greg closed the door, his mind already on autopilot, convinced that he had done his job, that he had apprehended a suspect, that justice had been served. He quickly radioed into the precinct. "Suspect in custody," he said, his voice calm, confident. "Bringing her in now." As he pulled away from the curb, the sirens wailing faintly in the distance, Dana sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, staring out of the window. The city lights blurred past her as she felt the weight of the moment sink deeper into her bones. This was more than just a mistake. This was an indictment of everything she had fought for, everything she had believed in. The system had failed her, just as it had failed so many others before her. And what came next would change everything. Dana Wells sat in the cramped holding cell, the cold steel of the bench beneath her only serving to heighten her sense of disbelief. How had it come to this? How had she, a captain in the very police department she had devoted her life to, ended up in a situation like this? The quiet hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh glow making the room feel even more sterile and unwelcoming. The walls, lined with dull gray cinder blocks, seemed to close in on her, reflecting the emotions swirling inside her mind. Her hands, which had been cuffed until just moments before, now rested in her lap, her wrists still sore from the tightness of the restraints. She massaged them absent-mindedly, though her thoughts were far from her physical discomfort. Her mind replayed the scene from the street over and over, like a broken record that refused to stop. The moment Officer Greg Mathers had pulled her over, the way he had disregarded her words, her identity, how he had ignored the truth, staring him right in the face. Captain Dana Wells, a woman who had given over a decade of her life to law enforcement, who had worked tirelessly to bring fairness and equity to the department, who had climbed through the ranks despite every obstacle thrown in her way. And now, after all that, she sat here, humiliated, her authority stripped from her by the very system she had sworn to protect and improve. The holding area was mostly empty, save for a few officers passing by from time to time, their eyes flickering toward her in confusion, perhaps a hint of pity. But no one spoke to her directly. There was an awkward tension in the air, a sense that something deeply wrong had happened, yet no one knew exactly how to address it. Dana's pulse was still racing, though she forced herself to remain calm. She knew she couldn't afford to lose her composure, not now. The anger simmering beneath her calm exterior was like a storm waiting to break, but she tamped it down with every breath. This wasn't the time to explode. No, she needed to think, to figure out what came next. She was the one always in control, always level-headed in the face of chaos, and she couldn't afford to be anything less now, even if it was her dignity that had been so callously trampled. The door to the precinct's intake room opened with a sudden creak, and Sergeant Maria Lopez strode in, her expression a mix of concern and disbelief. Dana watched as Lopez scanned the room, her eyes widening slightly as she spotted Dana behind the bars. For a moment, Lopez hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle as if she needed to collect herself before confronting the reality of what had happened. "Captain Wells?" Lopez's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "What in the world is going on?" Dana stood, brushing off the front of her sweatshirt, though her actions were more out of habit than necessity. "You tell me, Sergeant," she replied coolly, though the edge in her voice was undeniable. "One of your officers just arrested me. Officer Mathers. Apparently, I fit the description of a robbery suspect." Lopez's face went pale. She quickly fumbled with the keys on her belt, unlocking the door to the holding cell and stepping inside. I had no idea. This has to be a mistake. It is, Dana said, her voice firm but restrained. But it's more than just a mistake, Maria. It's a failure. A failure of judgment, a failure of training. And right now, it's making this department look like a complete joke. Lopez bit her lip, her eyes darting toward the door as if she expected someone else to walk in and magically fix the situation. I'm so sorry, Captain. Let me get you out of here, and I'll handle this immediately. Dana didn't argue. She stepped out of the holding cell, her back straight, her face a mask of composure. As they walked down the hallway toward her office, Dana's mind continued to whirl. The precinct was quieter than usual. The officers still at their desks seemed to sense that something was off, but no one said anything as they passed. They reached Dana's office, and Lopez quickly closed the door behind them, her face still flushed with embarrassment and discomfort. Captain, I swear, we had no idea it was you. Officer Mathers. I don't even think he knows yet. He's filing the report now. Dana raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. He doesn't know yet? After all this time? Lopez swallowed hard. I don't think he recognized you, Captain. He thought he was following protocol. There was a description, a suspect, and he acted. It was only after you were brought in that anyone realized who you are. Dana sat behind her desk, her hands resting on the surface, though she resisted the urge to slam her fist against it. He didn't even bother to listen when I told him who I was, she said, her voice colder now. That's the problem, Maria. It's not just about mistaken identity. It's about the fact that he looked at me and saw a criminal. He saw a black woman in a sweatshirt and jeans and decided that was enough. Lopez winced, knowing the truth in those words. I'll make sure Officer Mathers is aware of the mistake, Captain. I'll get him in here to apologize immediately. Dana narrowed her eyes. This isn't about an apology, Sergeant. This is about a systemic issue. This is about bias, prejudice, things we've been trying to root out for years, and yet here we are. Lopez nodded, looking chastened. I understand, Captain. I'll start the internal review process. This will be investigated thoroughly. Dana sighed, leaning back in her chair. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay finally began to seep into her bones. Good. But this doesn't end with just an investigation, Maria. This needs to be a wake-up call for the entire department. What happened to me is just one example of a much larger problem. As Lopez nodded, her expression serious, the door to Dana's office swung open without warning, and in stepped Officer Greg Mathers, his face pale, his eyes wide with confusion and horror. He had finally been told. Captain Wells, he stammered, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't realize it was you. Dana turned her chair to face him fully, her expression unreadable. For a moment she said nothing, simply letting the weight of the situation settle over him. She could see the fear and guilt written all over his face, and while part of her wanted to let him off easy, to chalk this up to a simple mistake, she knew that wasn't the right thing to do. Officer Mathers, she began, her voice calm but unyielding. You arrested me without even bothering to check my identification. I told you multiple times who I was, and you ignored me. You assumed that because I matched a vague description, I was guilty. Greg's eyes flickered with panic. Captain, I was just following the description from dispatch. You fit it perfectly, and I thought I was doing the right thing. Dana's jaw tightened. The right thing? She let out a slow breath, keeping her voice steady. The right thing would have been to take a moment and listen to me. The right thing would have been to ask for identification before slapping handcuffs on someone. But instead, you saw what you wanted to see. Greg's mouth opened and closed, as if he was struggling to find the right words, but none came. His face flushed with shame, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. "I'm sorry, Captain. I really am. I never meant to disrespect you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I'm sure you didn't," Donna said, her voice softening just a fraction. "But what you meant doesn't erase what you did. This isn't just about me, Officer Mathers. This is about how we, as police officers, interact with the people we are supposed to protect. If you couldn't listen to me, your captain, when I told you who I was, what does that say about how you treat the civilians we encounter every day?" Greg blinked, his expression slowly shifting from defensive to reflective. The weight of Dana's words was sinking in, and he could feel the magnitude of his mistake more fully now. He had been so certain, so sure, that he was acting correctly in the moment. But now, faced with the reality of what he had done, he realized how wrong he had been. Dana didn't let him off the hook just yet. "You didn't see a person, Greg. You saw a threat, and you reacted based on that assumption without stopping to question it. That's a problem. And it's not just your problem. It's a problem throughout this department, and frankly, across the entire police force." Greg stood there, silent, his face downcast. He had no words of defense left. He had nothing to say that could change what had happened. Lopez, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward. "Captain, I'll make sure Officer Mathers undergoes a full review, and I'll be recommending further training for all of our officers regarding racial bias and appropriate procedures." Dana nodded, though her mind was already moving forward, thinking about the broader implications of what had happened. "Good. But it's not just about training. We need to start holding people accountable for these mistakes, and we need to do more than just pay lip service to the idea of reform. Otherwise, we're just going to keep finding ourselves in the same situation over and over again." Greg nodded slowly, his face still pale, as if he was just beginning to understand the full scope of what Dana had been saying. Dana leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Officer Mathers, I expect better from you. I expect better from all of us. Do you understand that?" He swallowed hard and nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Captain, I do." With that, Dana dismissed him with a wave of her hand, and Greg quietly left the office, still visibly shaken. Sergeant Lopez remained, her posture tense. "Captain, I'm truly sorry this happened. We'll fix this, I promise." Dana nodded, though the heaviness in her heart remained. "Make sure we do, Maria. Make sure we do." The news spread through the precinct like wildfire, faster than anyone could have anticipated. By the time Dana Wells had left her office, the whispers had started. Officers who had been filing reports, attending to paperwork, or casually chatting with one another suddenly turned their heads. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and curious eyes followed Dana as she moved through the corridors. The atmosphere had shifted, and everyone knew it. The incident, the arrest, was already the talk of the department. Dana could feel the weight of those stares but ignored them. She had been in the spotlight before, but not like this. This wasn't the kind of attention that came with earning commendations or solving a high-profile case. No, this was something else, something insidious. It was the uncomfortable mix of disbelief, pity, and gossip. They were looking at her like she was both a victim and an anomaly. The fact that someone as high-ranking and respected as Captain Dana Wells had been wrongly arrested by one of her own officers wasn't just shocking, it was a scandal. And it wasn't going away anytime soon. She walked with purpose, her head held high, though the humiliation still simmered beneath the surface. The holding cell incident wasn't just a personal embarrassment, it was a public one, and Dana knew that it would have consequences far beyond the walls of the precinct. She could already hear the murmurs. "Did you hear? Officer Mathers arrested Captain Wells by mistake. Wait, Captain. Wells? Seriously? How does that even happen? Man, he's screwed. This is going to blow up. You think they'll fire him?" Dana tuned out the chatter, her focus now on the larger picture. She had always prided herself on keeping her emotions in check, but the sheer weight of the situation was bearing down on her. The department she had dedicated her life to was at a crossroads, and she couldn't afford to let her personal feelings cloud her judgment. What had happened to her was a symptom of something much deeper, a systemic problem that ran through the veins of not just her department, but law enforcement as a whole. As she stepped outside the precinct, the cool evening air hit her face like a slap, jolting her out of her thoughts. The low hum of distant traffic provided a strange contrast to the stillness that seemed to hang in the air around her. For a moment, Dana allowed herself to pause, standing on the steps of the building, her eyes scanning the street. She had always thought of the precinct as her second home, a place where she could make a difference, where she had real power to change things for the better. But after what had happened, the precinct felt foreign, as if she no longer truly belonged there. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention back to reality. She pulled it out, her thumb instinctively swiping across the screen. A notification popped up, a text from her partner asking if she was okay. Dana hadn't had the chance to fully explain what had happened, and she wasn't sure she was ready to. How could she? How could she put into words the sheer indignity of being arrested by one of her own, of having her authority stripped away in an instant? She hesitated for a moment before typing back a simple, non-committal response. "I'm fine. I'll be home soon. Long day." As she slid her phone back into her pocket, Dana noticed movement down the street. A small group of people was gathered on the corner, their faces lit up by the glow of their phones. Several of them were holding their devices up, recording something or someone. It took her a moment to realize what was happening. The group was fixated on the precinct, and more specifically, on her. They were recording her, taking pictures, no doubt already aware of the story that had been circulating online. Her arrest, captured on camera by a bystander, had already gone viral. The thought sent a fresh wave of frustration through her. She hadn't even had time to process the full implications of what had happened, and already it was out of her control. The video, no doubt shaky and incomplete, would be the first impression the public had of the incident. The narrative would be shaped by the angles and the commentary of people who didn't know the full story, who didn't know her. Dana could imagine the headlines: "Black female police captain wrongly arrested by white officer." It was a sensational story, one that fed into a larger, deeply entrenched narrative of racial bias in policing. As much as she hated it, Dana knew this was bigger than her now. Her mind raced, thinking about how the department would handle this. The chief had already called her earlier, leaving a voicemail that was equal parts apologetic and panicked. "We'll handle this, Dana," he had said. "We can't let this get out of hand. Let's not make a big deal out of it. We need to be united on this." But Dana wasn't sure she agreed. Letting this go, sweeping it under the rug, wasn't going to solve anything. If she didn't speak out, if she didn't demand accountability, what message would that send to the rest of the department? To the community she served? The image of her being handcuffed on the street was now public, a symbol of the very thing she had been fighting against her entire career: unconscious bias, racial profiling, and the systemic flaws within policing. She was snapped out of her thoughts by a sudden vibration in her pocket. Another message, this time from the department's PR office. It was short and to the point. "We need to talk about the press. Call me ASAP." Dana clenched her jaw, her frustration mounting. The press. Of course, this was where it was headed. The department would want to control the narrative, to spin it in a way that minimized damage. She could already see it. Vague statements about mistakes and unfortunate misunderstandings. The kind of language that smoothed over the rough edges without addressing the root of the problem. She sighed heavily, her breath visible in the cool air. There would be no easy way out of this, no simple fix. The protests would come next. She was certain of it. The video of her arrest would fuel outrage, not just from those who already distrusted the police, but from people who had once believed in the system, people who had looked up to her as a symbol of progress. Dana knew that she represented something bigger to a lot of people. Her rise through the ranks had been seen as a victory, a sign that things were changing, that the police could evolve into something better. But now, this incident threatened to unravel all of that. As she descended the steps, she saw the reporters. They were gathered at the edge of the sidewalk, just beyond the barricades that had been hastily set up to keep the public at bay. Cameras clicked and flashed, and microphones were thrust forward as Dana approached. Questions were shouted in rapid succession. "Captain Wells, do you have any comment on your wrongful arrest? Do you believe this was racially motivated? What does this incident say about the state of the department?" Dana stopped short, her body tense as she considered her next move. She hadn't expected the press to descend on her so quickly, but she should have known better. They were hungry for a story, and this was a juicy one. She could see the headlines already forming in their minds, the clicks and views they'd generate. It was tempting to give them what they wanted, to stand in front of the cameras and lay bare the truth about what had happened. But she also knew that a single word out of place could inflame the situation even further. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to see Sergeant Lopez hurrying toward her, her expression strained. "Captain, we've got to get you inside. This is blowing up fast." Dana nodded curtly, her eyes still fixed on the cameras and reporters, but she allowed Lopez to guide her back inside the precinct. The press, undeterred, continued to shout questions at her retreating figure, the sound of their voices fading only as the doors swung shut behind her. Once inside, Lopez turned to face Dana, her hands fidgeting nervously. "The chief's in a meeting with the mayor. They're scrambling to figure out how to handle this, and, there's already a protest starting outside." "Of course there is," Dana said, rubbing her temple as the tension continued to build. "This was always going to happen, Maria." Lopez hesitated, then nodded. "They're worried. The higher-ups, I mean. They're afraid this could turn into a full-blown scandal. There's talk about releasing a statement soon, but they want your input first." Dana felt a surge of anger rise up in her chest. My input? Now they want my input? After I've already been humiliated in front of the entire department? After I've been made an example of exactly what's wrong with this place? Lopez shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Captain, they're just trying to keep things from spiraling out of control." Dana's eyes narrowed. Maybe things need to spiral out of control. Maybe that's the only way anything is going to change. For a moment, the two women stood in tense silence, the weight of the situation hanging between them. Finally, Lopez spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Look, Dana, I get it. What happened to you it's messed up. But the chief's trying to avoid this turning into something that we can't handle. He wants to keep the peace." Dana snorted. "Peace? There's no peace to keep. This department has been walking on a powder keg for years, and we all know it. I'm not interested in keeping the peace, Maria. I'm interested in fixing the problem." Lopez swallowed, her gaze flicking toward the door, as if expecting someone else to step in and take over the conversation. "So, what do you want to do then?" Dana didn't hesitate. "I want accountability. I want a public admission of what went wrong, and I want Officer Mathers and anyone else involved to face consequences. Real consequences, not just a slap on the wrist." Lopez nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes remained. "I'll pass that along to the chief. But, you know this isn't going to be easy, right? There are people higher up who won't want this to turn into a bigger issue than it already is." Dana straightened her posture, her voice firm. "It's already a big issue, Maria. And it's not going away." With that, she turned and headed down the hallway, leaving Lopez standing there, unsure of what to do next. Dana knew that what lay ahead would be difficult, that there would be pushback from all sides, but she was ready. She had fought too long and too hard to let this be swept under the rug. If the department didn't want to face the truth, then she would force them to, no matter the cost. Greg Mathers sat in the locker room, his back pressed against the cold metal of the lockers, his head buried in his hands. The noise of his fellow officers moving about the precinct, filing reports, answering phones, responding to dispatches, felt distant, muffled, like a far-off hum that barely registered in his mind. The silence in his head, however, was deafening. He had replayed the moment over and over again, trying to understand how things had gone so wrong. He had been so sure. In those crucial few minutes on the street, his training had kicked in, and every instinct he'd honed over the years told him he was making the right call. The suspect fit the description perfectly. Black female, gray sweatshirt, dark jeans. That was all he needed. His mind hadn't even entertained the possibility that the woman in front of him could be someone else, let alone his captain. How could he have missed that? How could he have failed so spectacularly? The realization hit him harder each time he thought about it. He had arrested his own captain, someone who outranked him, who had years more experience than he did, someone whose leadership was highly respected in the department, and not just any officer. Dana Wells, a captain who was known for her fairness, her competence, and her determination to reform the police department from within. Greg lifted his head slightly and stared down at his hands. They were shaking. Whether from adrenaline or nerves, he wasn't sure, but he couldn't seem to make them stop. He felt sick, like there was a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The locker room, usually a place where officers joked and decompressed after a shift, now felt suffocating, as if the air itself had turned against him. The door to the locker room swung open, and Greg tensed instinctively, his eyes darting toward the entrance. Sergeant Lopez entered, her face set in a grim expression. Greg had seen her like this before. No nonsense, focused, the kind of expression that usually preceded bad news. "Mathers," Lopez said, her voice low and tight. "We need to talk." Greg swallowed hard and stood up, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever conversation was about to happen, but he had no choice. Lopez gestured for him to follow her, and he did so in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. They walked down the hallway, past the bullpen where officers were busy with paperwork and responding to calls. A few of them glanced at Greg as he passed, but none of them said anything. The silence felt worse than any words they could have thrown at him. Greg knew that the entire precinct had heard by now. Everyone knew what had happened. His mistake had become the defining story of the day. Lopez led him to a small conference room and closed the door behind them. The room was sparsely furnished, just a table and a few chairs, but the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Greg took a seat at the table, his hands resting on his knees, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Lopez remained standing, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The tension in the room was thick, and Greg could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, making the silence almost unbearable. Finally, Lopez spoke, her voice calm, but with an unmistakable edge of frustration. "Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Greg's throat felt dry, and he struggled to find his voice. I know, Sergeant. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Lopez let out a sharp breath, her hands dropping to her sides. "Whether you meant for it to happen or not doesn't change the fact that it did. You arrested Captain Wells, one of our own. A captain, Greg. Do you understand the gravity of that?" Greg nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. "I thought I was following protocol. The description matched. I thought I had the right suspect." "The description matched?" Lopez's voice rose slightly, incredulous. "Is that all it takes? A vague description, and you immediately assume guilt? You didn't even stop to check her identification, did you? Greg's face flushed with shame. No, I didn't. I thought she was trying to, I don't know, talk her way out of it. I've seen people do it before. Lopez stared at him, her expression hard. Talk her way out of it? She told you she was Captain Wells. You didn't listen. You didn't even consider the possibility that she was telling the truth. Greg dropped his gaze to the table, unable to meet her eyes. His mind was spinning, filled with regret, but he didn't know how to fix what he had broken. How could he? There was no going back, no undoing the arrest, no erasing the humiliation he had caused. Lopez pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, leaning forward slightly. Greg, this isn't just about you making a mistake. This is about the fact that you saw a black woman in a sweatshirt and immediately thought she was guilty. You didn't question it. You didn't hesitate. You acted on instinct, and your instincts were wrong. Greg winced at her words. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules, someone who did the right thing. But now, he was being forced to confront the fact that his instincts, his judgment, had been shaped by something much darker, something he didn't want to admit. I didn't mean to, he began, but Lopez cut him off. I know you didn't mean to, Greg, but that's the problem. It's not about your intentions. It's about the impact of your actions, and the impact here is huge. Captain Wells is one of the most respected officers in this department, and you treated her like a criminal. Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends? Greg shook his head, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. I didn't think, he muttered, trailing off. No, you didn't, Lopez said sharply. And now we're all going to have to deal with the fallout. The words stung, but Greg knew she was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. His actions had affected the entire department, and the repercussions were only just beginning. Lopez sighed, leaning back in her chair. The video of the arrest is already all over social media. It's gone viral. There are protests forming outside the precinct right now. People are angry, and they have every right to be. This isn't just a PR nightmare, Greg. This is a crisis. Greg's heart sank even further. He had known the video would surface eventually. There had been people on the street recording the arrest, but he hadn't realized how quickly it would spread. The thought of millions of people watching the footage, seeing his mistake in real time, made his stomach churn. What's going to happen now? He asked, his voice small. Lopez looked at him for a long moment before answering. The chief is in a meeting with the mayor. They're trying to figure out how to handle this, but it's not looking good. There's talk about you being suspended, maybe even terminated. Greg felt the blood drain from his face. Terminated? The thought hadn't even crossed his mind until now, but it made sense. This wasn't the kind of mistake you could recover from easily. He had arrested a captain, his own captain, and now the entire department was in damage control mode. Lopez watched him, her expression softening slightly. Look, Greg, I know you didn't mean for any of this to happen, but this is bigger than you now. The department is going to have to make a statement, and they need to show that they're taking this seriously. That means there's going to be consequences, whether you like it or not. Greg nodded slowly, though his mind was still reeling from the possibility of losing his job. He had worked so hard to get here, had put in the hours, the effort, the training. And now, because of one moment of poor judgment, it could all be gone. I understand, he said quietly, though the words felt hollow. Lopez stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. For what it's worth, Greg, I don't think you're a bad cop. But you need to start thinking more carefully about how you do your job. There's a lot more at stake here than just catching suspects. You've got to think about how your actions affect people, how they reflect on the department. If you can't do that, then maybe this isn't the right place for you. Her words hung in the air, and Greg felt them pierce through him like a knife. He had never thought of himself as anything less than a good cop, someone who was dedicated to the job. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that maybe he wasn't as good as he thought he was. Maybe his instincts weren't as reliable as he'd believed. Maybe he had a lot more to learn. Lopez left the room, leaving Greg alone with his thoughts. He sat there in silence, staring at the table in front of him, his mind a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, shame, fear, confusion. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, and he wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to shake it off. As the minutes ticked by, Greg thought about what Lopez had said, about the protests outside, about the video that was now circulating online. His actions had caused a firestorm, one that wouldn't be easily extinguished. He could feel his future slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky beneath him, and left the conference room. As he walked down the hallway, the familiar sights and sounds of the precinct felt foreign, distant, like he was walking through someone else's life. He passed a few officers, their eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of sympathy and judgment. But no one said anything. Greg made his way outside, stepping into the cool evening air. The sound of the protests was louder now, voices raised in anger, signs waving in the air. He stood on the steps of the precinct, watching as the crowd gathered, their chants echoing in the street. Justice for Captain Wells. No more police brutality. Hold them accountable. Greg's heart pounded in his chest. He had never been on this side of the equation before. He had always been the one inside the precinct, the one wearing the badge, the one people looked to for protection. But now, he felt like he was the enemy. He wasn't sure what came next. His career, his reputation, his future. They all felt uncertain now, like they were slipping through his grasp. And in that moment, standing on the steps of the precinct, Greg Mathers finally understood just how deep the problem went. Dana Wells sat in her office, the door closed to the noise of the bustling precinct outside. The dim light of her desk lamp cast long shadows on the walls, giving the small room a quiet, almost eerie feel. She had been sitting at her desk for what felt like hours, though she hadn't gotten any work done. A blank report sat in front of her, the cursor on her computer screen blinking, waiting for her to type something. But she couldn't focus. Her mind kept drifting back to the events of the last 24 hours. The adrenaline from the arrest had faded, leaving behind a kind of emotional exhaustion that Dana rarely allowed herself to feel. Her body ached from the tension she'd been holding in ever since Officer Greg Mathers had cuffed her on that street corner. The humiliation she had pushed down earlier now lingered, bitter and heavy. No matter how many times she replayed the scene in her head, she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Dana had spent her entire career fighting for the respect and trust of her peers. As a black woman in law enforcement, she had always known she had to be twice as good, twice as tough, just to be seen as equal to her colleagues. She had worked her way up from patrol to detective, from detective to sergeant, and now, finally, she was a captain. And yet, despite all of her accomplishments, despite everything she had done for the department, one of her own officers had arrested her, without listening to her, without recognizing her, without even questioning his own assumptions. She clenched her jaw and leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling. The department had always been a second home to her. She had poured her heart and soul into this place, into the idea that she could make a difference from the inside. She had seen the systemic issues, the biases, the unfair treatment, particularly against people of color, and she had tried to change things. She had pushed for diversity training, implemented policies to address racial profiling, and advocated for community policing efforts to rebuild trust between the police and the neighborhoods they served. And yet, after all that, she had ended up in the back of a squad car, handcuffed, like a criminal. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a text from her partner, Emma. "How are you holding up? Everyone's talking about it at the station. Call me if you need to talk." Dana sighed. Emma worked as a firefighter at a station across town, and although their professions were similar, the cultures of their respective departments couldn't have been more different. While Dana had to navigate the politics, biases, and unspoken rules of a historically male-dominated, predominantly white police force, Emma's station felt more like a family, tight-knit and supportive. It was a reality that Dana envied sometimes, though she would never admit it out loud. She wanted to respond to Emma's message, to reassure her that she was fine, that everything would blow over soon. But the truth was, Dana wasn't sure if she was fine. She wasn't sure if this was something she could just push aside, something she could shrug off and move on from. A knock at the door broke the silence. "Come in," Dana called, sitting up straighter in her chair, pushing her emotions down as much as she could. The door opened, and Chief Henry Marshall stepped inside. He was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, his once black hair now streaked with gray. His uniform was immaculate, as always, the gold stars on his collar gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Dana had always respected him, despite their occasional disagreements on policy. He was old school in many ways, but he had supported her when she had pushed for reforms, and she appreciated that. But today, there was something different in his expression, something heavier, more guarded. "Dana," he said, his voice low and somber, "we need to talk." Dana motioned for him to sit in the chair opposite her desk, and the chief closed the door behind him before taking a seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, and Dana could sense that this conversation wasn't going to be easy. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," Marshall finally said, his eyes meeting hers. Dana nodded slowly. "I figured." The chief leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Look, Dana, you know I have a lot of respect for you. I've watched you rise through the ranks, and I've seen the positive impact you've had on this department. But what happened yesterday? Well, it's caused a lot of problems." Dana's stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. "I'm aware. The protests are still going on outside." Marshall exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yes, and they're not getting any smaller. The press is all over this, and the mayor is, well, let's just say he's not happy. He's worried about how this is going to affect public trust in the department." Public trust? Dana almost scoffed at the irony. Public trust had already been eroded long before this incident, and not just because of one mistake by a single officer. It was because of years of systemic issues, years of people in power refusing to address the root causes of the mistrust between the police and the community. "Chief," Dana said, keeping her voice measured, "this isn't just about one mistake. What happened yesterday is part of a much bigger problem. We've been ignoring it for too long." Marshall's gaze sharpened, and for a moment she saw the weariness in his eyes. He had been in law enforcement for decades, had seen his share of scandals, corruption, and missteps. But Dana could tell that this situation was different. This wasn't just about a public relations nightmare. This was about the very fabric of the department coming unraveled. "I know," Marshall admitted quietly, his voice heavy. "You think I don't see it? You think I haven't tried to fix it? The truth is, Dana, the department is a machine, and machines don't change overnight. We've been trying to patch up leaks for years, but every time we fix one, another one springs open. It's a constant battle." Dana leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. "I understand that, Chief, but we can't keep acting like this is just business as usual. We can't sweep this under the rug and hope it goes away." "I'm not saying we should," Marshall replied, his voice firm. "But we have to be smart about how we handle this. The mayor is already talking about launching an independent investigation into the incident, and I won't lie to you, Dana. Officer Mathers might lose his job over this." Dana's stomach clenched. She hadn't expected to feel conflicted about Greg Mather's fate, but hearing the chief's words made her pause. Greg had made a serious mistake, one that had humiliated her and exposed the deep flaws in the department's culture. But part of her wondered if firing him would actually solve anything, or if it was just an easy way for the department to distance itself from the problem. "This isn't just about Greg Mathers," Dana said quietly. "This is about the way we train our officers, the way we address or fail to address bias. Firing him won't fix that." Marshall nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "You're right, but we have to do something to show the public that we're taking this seriously. If we don't, this department will lose what little credibility it has left." Dana stared at her desk, her mind racing. She wanted accountability, but not just for Greg Mathers. She wanted real change, reforms that would address the systemic issues that had led to this moment. But she knew how the department worked. She knew that the people in charge were more concerned with managing optics than making real, lasting changes. The mayor would want a quick fix, something that would satisfy the public and make the protests go away. But Dana wasn't interested in quick fixes. "What about the reforms I've been pushing for?" Dana asked, her voice steady. "The bias training, the revised arrest protocols? We've been talking about these changes for months, but they keep getting delayed." Marshall sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know. And I agree with you that those reforms are necessary. But the department's resources are stretched thin as it is. Implementing new training programs takes time, money, and manpower. And right now, we're dealing with a lot of pressure from the top to contain this situation." Dana clenched her fists under the desk. The same excuses, the same bureaucratic hurdles. She had been hearing them for years, and she was tired of it. The department could find the money for new equipment, for tactical gear, for public relations campaigns. But when it came to addressing the root issues, issues of bias, inequality, and accountability, there was always some excuse, some reason why things couldn't move forward. "I'm not asking for miracles," Dana said, her voice sharp. "But we need to start somewhere. If we don't, then what happened to me is just going to keep happening. To other people, to civilians who don't have the rank or the platform to speak out." Marshall's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, Dana saw a flicker of empathy. "I hear you, Dana, I do, and I'll support you in pushing for those reforms. But you have to understand, there's going to be resistance, not just from the higher-ups, but from within the department. A lot of people don't want to admit that we have a problem." "I'm not afraid of resistance," Dana replied, her voice firm. "I'm afraid of doing nothing." Marshall nodded, though his expression remained grave. "All right. Let's take this one step at a time. The mayor's office is going to release a statement soon, and they'll likely announce the independent investigation. That will buy us some time, but we need to be ready. I want you to put together a proposal for the reforms you've been advocating for. We'll push it through, but we'll need to be strategic about it." Dana felt a small glimmer of hope, though it was tempered by the knowledge of how slow and painful the process would likely be. Still, it was something. It was a start. "I'll have the proposal ready by the end of the week," Dana said, her voice resolute. "Good," Marshall replied. He stood up, his expression still serious, but less guarded than before. "And Dana, take care of yourself. This isn't going to be easy, and there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on you, but you're one of the best officers we have, and I don't want to lose you." Dana looked up at him, her eyes hard but appreciative. "I'm not going anywhere, Chief. Not until we get this right." Marshall gave her a small nod, then turned and left the office, closing the door softly behind him. As soon as he was gone, Dana let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. The weight of the conversation, of the situation, of everything that had happened, pressed down on her, but she refused to let it crush her. She had come too far, fought too hard to back down now. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up, swiping the screen to read Emma's message once more. She thought about calling her, about hearing Emma's voice, about finding some comfort in the middle of all this chaos. But she hesitated. Emma had always been supportive, but Dana knew that this was something she had to face on her own, at least for now. She typed out a quick response. "I'm okay. Just a lot going on. I'll see you later tonight." As she put the phone down, Dana stared at the blank report on her computer screen. There was so much to do, so much to think about, but she knew she had to focus. The reforms she had been pushing for were more important now than ever, and she couldn't afford to lose sight of that. She began typing, the sound of the keyboard filling the silence of her office. Outside, the protest continued, the voices of the crowd growing louder, more insistent. They were demanding change, demanding justice, and Dana knew that she had to be a part of that change. She had to use her position, her influence, to push for something better, something that would ensure that what had happened to her would never happen again, to anyone. She worked late into the night, her determination fueling her, keeping her focused. The events of the past day had shaken her, but they had also ignited a fire within her, a fire that she wasn't going to let burn out. Not until the job was done. Not until the department she had given her life to was finally the kind of place she could be proud of. And if that meant fighting every step of the way, then so be it. Dana Wells wasn't one to back down from a fight. Not now. Not ever. Dana Wells sat at the press conference table, her back straight, her hands clasped together on the surface before her. The room was packed with reporters, their faces a mixture of curiosity and determination, each one eager to capture the story of the day. Cameras flashed intermittently, their bright lights cutting through the dimness of the large conference room. The air was thick with tension, anticipation humming like an electric current that pulsed through the gathered crowd. To Dana's right sat Chief Marshal, his face a stern mask of authority, though Dana could see the exhaustion in his eyes. To her left was the mayor, a man more concerned with political survival than justice, his expression carefully neutral. Other senior officials and department heads flanked them on either side, a united front meant to project stability and control in the midst of a brewing storm. The protest outside the precinct had grown in size and intensity, with hundreds of people now gathered, their voices rising in unison as they demanded accountability and change. The chants echoed faintly through the walls of the building, a constant reminder that this was more than just a press conference. It was a moment of reckoning for the entire police department. Dana felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was her chance to speak, to address what had happened, and to push for the changes she knew were desperately needed. But she also knew the stakes were high. One wrong word, one misstep, and the situation could spiral even further out of control. The department's reputation, her career, and the trust of the community were all on the line. The mayor was the first to speak, his voice calm and measured, the practiced tone of a politician who had weathered many storms before. "Good afternoon," he began, his eyes sweeping across the room. "Thank you all for coming. We're here today to address the incident that occurred 2 days ago involving Captain Dana Wells. As many of you are aware, Captain Wells was mistakenly arrested by one of our officers during a routine patrol. This incident has understandably caused a great deal of concern, both within our community and beyond. Ati." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the room, before continuing. "Let me be clear. What happened was unacceptable. We are committed to ensuring that this kind of incident does not happen again. To that end, we have launched an independent investigation into the matter. This investigation will be thorough, and we will hold those responsible accountable for their actions." Dana listened to the mayor's words, her expression neutral. She knew that this was the part where the city tried to control the narrative, to reassure the public that everything was under control, that they were taking the right steps. But she also knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. The people outside weren't calling for an investigation, They were calling for real, tangible change, and that was what Dana was here to push for. The mayor finished his statement, and the chief took his turn at the microphone. "I want to echo the mayor's sentiments," Chief Marshal said, his voice gravelly but clear. "Captain Wells is one of our most dedicated and respected officers. The fact that this happened to her is deeply troubling, and it highlights issues within our department that we must address." Marshall glanced at Dana, and she gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the support he was offering her in that moment. He continued, "As the investigation proceeds, we will also be reviewing our current protocols and training programs. It is imperative that our officers are equipped with the knowledge and skills to avoid situations like this in the future. We owe that to our community and to the men and women who serve it." When Marshall finished, there was a brief, tense silence in the room. Then all eyes turned to Dana. This was her moment. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room. The camera lights were bright, nearly blinding, but she focused on the faces behind them, the reporters, the officials, the community leaders who had gathered to hear what she had to say. "Thank you," Dana began, her voice calm and steady. "I want to start by saying that what happened to me was not just a mistake. It was a symptom of a much larger problem within our police department, and frankly, within law enforcement as a whole. This isn't just about one officer making an error in judgment. This is about the systemic issues that allowed that error to happen in the first place." The room was silent, the tension palpable as the reporters leaned in, their pens and recorders at the ready. Dana could feel the weight of her words, the responsibility of speaking out, but she pressed on. "I've spent my career working to address these issues: bias, inequality, the breakdown of trust between the police and the communities we serve. I've seen firsthand how these problems affect not just the people we're sworn to protect, but also the officers who are trying to do their jobs. And let me be clear, this is not a problem that can be solved with a few quick fixes or public statements. It requires real, meaningful change." Dana paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "The independent investigation that's been announced is a good first step, but it's just that, a first step. What we need is a comprehensive approach to reform. We need to overhaul our training programs to ensure that every officer is equipped to make sound decisions in the field. We need to implement new protocols that address the biases that too often influence those decisions. And we need to hold ourselves accountable when we fall short." The cameras flashed as she spoke, capturing every word, every gesture. Dana could see the reporters jotting down notes, their expressions serious, intent. She knew that what she was saying would be scrutinized, dissected, and analyzed by the public, by her colleagues, by the people in power. But she didn't care. This was her truth, and it needed to be said. There are those who might say that we should just move on from this, that we should focus on the positive and not dwell on the mistakes. But I can't do that. We can't do that. Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. It only allows it to fester, to grow, and if we don't confront it head-on, then we're complicit in allowing it to continue. Dana felt a surge of emotion rise up within her, but she kept her voice steady, controlled. She had to remain composed, even as the passion for the change she sought burned within her. "I love this department," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I've dedicated my life to it because I believe in the work we do. I believe in the people who serve alongside me. But I also believe that we can be better. We have to be better, not just for ourselves, but for the communities we serve, for the people who rely on us to protect them, to treat them with dignity and respect." She glanced at the mayor, who was watching her carefully, his expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the reporters, to the cameras that were broadcasting her words to the world beyond this room. "I'm asking for more than just an investigation," Dana said, her voice firm. "I'm asking for a commitment to real reform, to addressing the deep-seated issues that have plagued our department for far too long. I'm asking for the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it means facing uncomfortable truths, because that's the only way we're going to build the kind of department that our community deserves." The room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the clicking of cameras. Dana could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, waiting for her next move, her next words. "I'm not here to point fingers or to assign blame," she continued, her tone steady. "But I am here to demand accountability. And I'm here to demand that we take this moment, this difficult, painful moment, and use it as an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to make the changes that are so desperately needed." Dana could see the expressions of the people around the table, the mayor, the chief, the other officials. Some looked supportive, others wary, but all of them seemed to understand the gravity of what she was saying. She took one final breath and finished her statement. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of police department we want to be, the kind of legacy we want to leave. We have a choice, right now, to do the right thing. Let's not waste it." With that, Dana leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. The room remained silent for a few moments longer, as if everyone was processing what had just been said. Then, the reporters began to murmur among themselves, the sound of scribbling pens and clicking keyboards filling the air. The mayor cleared his throat, clearly eager to regain control of the narrative. "Thank you, Captain Wells, for your powerful words. We appreciate your dedication to this department and your commitment to positive change. As we move forward, we will be working closely with Captain Wells and other leaders in our community to ensure that these issues are addressed and that our department becomes stronger as a result." The reporters began to raise their hands, eager to ask questions, but before the mayor could call on any of them, Chief Marshal leaned forward to speak into the microphone. "We'll be taking questions shortly, but I want to reiterate something that Captain Wells just said. This is an opportunity for us to grow as a department. We recognize that change is necessary, and we are committed to making that change happen. We ask for the public's patience and trust as we navigate this process, and we pledge to be transparent and accountable every step of the way." Dana could feel the tension in the room easing slightly, though the undercurrent of urgency remained. The press conference would continue, with reporters asking questions, seeking more information, trying to probe deeper into the issues at hand. But Dana had said what she needed to say. She had made her position clear. As the mayor and the chief began fielding questions from the reporters, Dana sat back, her mind already shifting to the next steps. She knew that the real work was only just beginning. The press conference was just the start of a long and difficult process, one that would require persistence, determination, and most importantly, action. After the press conference ended, Dana stood up, shaking hands with the mayor and the chief as they exchanged polite words. But she could sense the underlying tension, the unspoken concerns that lingered between them. The mayor, in particular, seemed wary, as if he was unsure of how Dana's strong stance would play out in the court of public opinion. But she didn't care about that. What mattered to her was that the right thing was done, regardless of the political fallout. As Dana made her way out of the conference room, she was approached by several reporters, their questions coming at her in rapid succession. But she politely declined to answer, telling them that everything she had to say was already on the record. She had no interest in getting drawn into a media circus. Her focus was on the work that needed to be done. Once she was outside, she was greeted by the sight of the continuing protest. The crowd had grown even larger, spilling out into the streets, their voices rising in a chorus of demands for justice, for accountability, for change. Dana felt a surge of emotion as she looked out at the faces in the crowd, people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, united by a common cause. One of the protesters, a young woman with a handmade sign that read, "Justice for All," caught Dana's eye. Their gazes locked for a brief moment, and Dana felt a connection, a silent understanding that they were both fighting for the same thing. The woman nodded at her, a gesture of solidarity, and Dana nodded back. As she walked past the barricades, a few protesters recognized her, and she heard a smattering of applause and shouts of encouragement. It wasn't the usual reaction she received as a police officer, and it took her by surprise. But she appreciated it. It reminded her that despite everything, there were people out there who believed in her, who supported the changes she was advocating for. Dana made her way to her car, the noise of the protest fading slightly as she closed the door behind her. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to center herself. The day had been long and exhausting, but she knew that there was still much to do. Her phone buzzed with a new message, and she glanced down to see a text from Emma. "You were amazing today. So proud of you. Dinner at home tonight?" Dana smiled for the first time in what felt like days. She quickly typed back a response. "Thanks. I'd love that. See you soon." As she started the car and pulled away from the precinct, Dana felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles, but she was ready. She had made her stand, and now it was time to back up her words with action. She thought about the proposal she had promised the chief, the reforms that needed to be put in place, the conversations that would need to happen with the rank and file, with the union, with the community leaders. It was going to be a battle, but it was one she was prepared to fight. The streets were still crowded with protesters as she drove through the city, their signs and chants a constant reminder of the urgency of the moment. Dana felt a mix of emotions, pride, determination, and a deep sense of responsibility. The people were counting on her, on the department, to do the right thing, and she wasn't going to let them down. As she pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine, Dana sat in the silence for a moment, letting the events of the day wash over her. She thought about what had happened, about what still needed to happen. There was a lot at stake, but she was ready to face it, head on. She got out of the car and walked up to the front door, the weight of the day still on her shoulders but tempered by the thought of home, of Emma, of a quiet dinner and some much-needed rest. But even as she stepped inside, the work continued to churn in the back of her mind, the plans and strategies forming, the resolve hardening. Dana Wells was ready for what came next. Whatever it took, she would see this through, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged, for everyone who had ever lost faith in the system, for everyone who believed that real change was possible. She wouldn't rest until it was done. The weeks that followed the press conference were a whirlwind of activity, tension, and hard-fought progress. Dana Wells found herself thrust into the center of a storm that showed no signs of abating. Every day brought new challenges, new meetings, new confrontations. But she refused to back down. This was the fight she had been preparing for her entire career, and she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The independent investigation into her wrongful arrest was well underway, with a team of external auditors poring over every detail of the incident, examining not only what had happened on the street that day, but also the underlying issues within the department that had allowed it to happen in the first place. Dana met with the investigators several times, providing her account of the events, her insights into the department's culture, and her recommendations for what needed to change. Each meeting was grueling, but she knew it was necessary. She wanted the investigation to be thorough, to leave no stone unturned. But while the investigation was an important step, Dana knew it wasn't enough on its own. The reforms she had long advocated for were now more critical than ever. She had worked tirelessly to draft a comprehensive proposal that addressed the systemic issues she had seen throughout her career, issues that had been laid bare by her own experience. The proposal included mandatory bias training for all officers, a complete overhaul of the department's arrest protocols, the implementation of community policing initiatives, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to ensure accountability and transparency. Getting this proposal approved, however, was another battle entirely. Dana spent countless hours in meetings with the department's leadership, the police union, and city officials, negotiating, debating, and pushing for the changes she knew were necessary. It was exhausting work. The resistance she encountered was formidable. Some officers bristled at the idea of additional training, viewing it as an unnecessary burden or an insult to their professionalism. The union was particularly vocal in its opposition, arguing that the reforms would place undue pressure on officers and undermine their ability to do their jobs effectively. "We're out there risking our lives every day," one union representative had said during a particularly heated meeting. "And now you want to saddle us with more red tape? More hoops to jump through? This is going to make it harder for us to protect the community, not easier." Dana had listened to their concerns, understanding their perspective but remaining firm in her resolve. "This isn't about making your jobs harder," she had replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "It's about making sure that when you do your jobs, you're doing them right. It's about ensuring that everyone in this city, everyone, feels safe and respected, including our officers. These reforms aren't meant to punish you. They're meant to protect you, to protect the integrity of our department, and to build trust with the community we serve." But the resistance wasn't just internal. The mayor's office, while publicly supportive of the reforms, was cautious behind the scenes, wary of the political ramifications. Dana had several tense conversations with the mayor and his aides, who were concerned about the potential backlash from certain segments of the electorate, particularly those who viewed any criticism of the police as unpatriotic or anti-law enforcement. "The optics of this are tricky," the mayor had said during one meeting. "We need to be careful how we frame this. We can't afford to alienate our base." Dana had felt a surge of frustration at his words. "This isn't about optics," she had shot back. "This is about doing what's right. We can't keep playing politics with people's lives. The community is demanding change, and we have a responsibility to deliver that change. If we don't, we're going to lose whatever trust we have left." The mayor had looked at her for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he had sighed and nodded. "All right, Dana, you have my support, but we need to be smart about this. We need to bring people along with us, not push them away." With the mayor's tentative backing, Dana pressed forward. She spent her days in a relentless cycle of meetings, drafting and redrafting her proposal, responding to feedback, and building coalitions with community leaders, activists, and other stakeholders who were equally committed to seeing the reforms through. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally, but Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose with each small victory. Yet, despite the progress being made on the policy front, the personal toll was becoming harder to ignore. Dana had always been good at compartmentalizing her emotions, at keeping her work life separate from her personal life, but the events of the past few weeks had blurred those lines. The stress, the pressure, the constant scrutiny, they were all beginning to take a toll on her. At home, Emma could see the strain Dana was under, even if Dana tried to hide it. She would come home late, exhausted, often falling asleep on the couch before dinner was even ready. Emma, ever supportive, did her best to be there for her, to provide a safe space where Dana could decompress and escape from the chaos of her day-to-day life. But even Emma knew that there was only so much she could do. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Dana came home to find Emma waiting for her with a concerned look on her face. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of jazz playing softly in the background. Dana dropped her bag by the door and let out a weary sigh. "You look exhausted," Emma said gently, coming over to give her a hug. "You need to take a break, Dana. You can't keep going like this." Dana leaned into the embrace, closing her eyes for a moment. The warmth and comfort of Emma's arms were a welcome relief from the tension that had been building up inside her. "I can't stop now," she murmured. "There's too much at stake." Emma pulled back slightly, looking into Dana's eyes. "I know, but you're only human. You need to rest. You can't pour from an empty cup, remember?" Dana smiled faintly at the familiar phrase, one Emma had said to her many times before. "I know you're right," she admitted, "but I can't afford to slow down, not with everything that's happening." Emma took her hand and led her to the couch where they both sat down. "Dana, you're doing everything you can, more than anyone could ask for, but you're no good to anyone if you burn out. You need to take care of yourself too." Dana looked down at their intertwined hands, feeling the weight of Emma's words. She knew she was pushing herself to the limit, but she couldn't shake the feeling that if she let up, even for a moment, everything she had worked for would slip through her fingers. I feel like I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders," Dana confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "There's so much pressure, so many people counting on me. I can't let them down." Emma squeezed her hand, her voice soft but firm. "You're not alone in this, Dana. You have people who believe in you, who are standing with you. But you have to let them help you. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Dana felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at Emma, the love and concern in her eyes almost overwhelming. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Dana whispered, her voice breaking. "You'll never have to find out," Emma replied, pulling her into another hug. "I'm here for you, no matter what, but promise me you'll take care of yourself. You're no good to anyone if you're running on empty." Dana nodded, feeling the tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She hated showing vulnerability, hated admitting that she couldn't do it all on her own. But with Emma, she didn't have to pretend to be strong all the time. With Emma, she could let her guard down, even if just for a little while. "I promise," Dana said softly, leaning her head on Emma's shoulder. "I'll try to take better care of myself." They sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of the world momentarily lifted as they simply held each other. Dana knew that tomorrow would bring another round of battles, another day of fighting for the changes she believed in. But for now, she allowed herself to be present in this moment, to find comfort in Emma's embrace, to gather the strength she would need to keep going. The next morning, Dana woke up feeling slightly more rested, though the ever-present weight of her responsibilities was still there. She had a full day ahead of her, including a crucial meeting with the police union to finalize the details of the reform proposal. It was a meeting she had been dreading, knowing that the union was still resistant to many of the changes she was pushing for. But she also knew that this was a battle she had to win. When she arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. The protests outside had continued, though they had started to dwindle in size as the days went on. The public's attention was shifting to other issues, other scandals, but Dana knew that the work she was doing now would have lasting consequences, long after the media had moved on. The meeting with the union was scheduled for mid-morning, and as the time approached, Dana felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm and composed in high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't just about winning an argument or negotiating a contract. This was about the future of the department, about whether or not the reforms she had fought so hard for would actually come to fruition. The conference room where the meeting was being held was already filled with people when Dana arrived. The union representatives sat on one side of the table, their expressions guarded and wary. On the other side were the department's leadership, including Chief Marshal, who gave Dana a small nod as she took her seat. The tension in the room was palpable as the meeting began. The union representatives wasted no time in voicing their concerns, their arguments familiar to Dana by now. "We understand the need for reform," one of the union leaders said, his tone measured but firm. But these changes you're proposing, mandatory bias training, revised arrest protocols, independent oversight, are going to put a huge strain on our officers. They're already stretched thin as it is. Adding more requirements is only going to make their jobs harder. Dana listened patiently, waiting for her turn to respond. When it came, she spoke with the same calm authority that had carried her through so many difficult situations in the past. "I understand your concerns," she began, her voice steady. "But we can't afford to keep doing things the way we've always done them. The public's trust in us is eroding, and if we don't address the issues that are causing that erosion, we're going to lose that trust entirely. And once it's gone, it's almost impossible to get back." One of the union leaders leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "And you think these reforms are going to fix that? You think a few training sessions and new protocols are going to solve all our problems?" Dana met his gaze evenly. "No, I don't think they'll solve everything, but I do think they're a necessary first step. We have to start somewhere. We have to show the community that we're serious about making changes, that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable. If we don't, then we're just reinforcing the belief that we're part of the problem, not the solution." The room was silent for a moment as the union representatives considered her words. Dana could see the reluctance in their eyes, the resistance to change that was so deeply ingrained in the culture of the department. But she also saw something else, a flicker of understanding, of recognition that something needed to be done, even if they didn't fully agree with her methods. The conversation continued, with both sides making their arguments, negotiating the details of the proposal, looking for common ground. It was a long and difficult process, with moments of tension and frustration, but Dana refused to give up. She knew that this was her chance to make a real difference, to push through the changes that were so desperately needed. By the end of the meeting, they had reached a tentative agreement. The union had agreed to support the reforms, though with some concessions and compromises that Dana wasn't entirely happy with. But it was a start, it was progress, and it was something she could build on. As the meeting adjourned, Chief Marshal pulled Dana aside. "You did good in there," he said, his voice gruff but approving. "I know this wasn't easy, but you held your ground." Dana nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you, Chief. I just hope it's enough." Marshall gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "It's a start, and sometimes that's all we can ask for." Dana left the conference room feeling a sense of accomplishment, though tempered by the knowledge that there was still much work to be done. The reforms were just the beginning. The real challenge would be implementing them, making sure they were followed, and ensuring that they had the impact she knew they could. The next few weeks were consumed with the implementation of the reforms. Dana worked tirelessly with her team to roll out the new training programs, to revise the department's protocols, and to establish the Independent Oversight Committee. It was grueling work, but Dana threw herself into it with everything she had. The reaction from the rank and file was mixed. Some officers embraced the changes, recognizing the need for them, and appreciating the leadership Dana was showing. Others were more resistant, grumbling about the added requirements, the extra scrutiny, and the shift in the department's culture. Dana made it a point to visit as many precincts as she could, meeting with officers, answering their questions, addressing their concerns. She knew that for the reforms to be successful, she needed to get buy-in from the people on the ground, the ones who would be directly affected by them. During one such visit, Dana found herself in a heated discussion with a group of officers who were particularly skeptical of the new bias training. "This feels like a punishment," one officer said, his arms crossed over his chest, "like we're all being blamed for what happened to you." Dana shook her head, her voice firm but understanding. "This isn't about blame. It's about making sure that we're all doing our jobs to the best of our abilities. Bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, affects how we interact with the public, how we make decisions. This training is about recognizing those biases and learning how to counteract them. It's about being better officers, better public servants. Another officer spoke up, her tone more conciliatory. I get that. But some of us feel like we're being singled out, like the department doesn't trust us to do our jobs. Dana looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer in turn. I know it might feel that way, but that's not the intent. This is about building trust, both within the department and with the community. It's about making sure that when we put on this uniform, we're representing the best of what this department can be, and that starts with us. Right here, right now. There was a long pause as the officers considered her words. Dana could see the uncertainty in their faces, the hesitation, but also the willingness to listen, to give the new programs a chance. It wasn't an easy sell, but Dana knew that change never was. It required patience, persistence, and the willingness to have difficult conversations. As she left the precinct that day, Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, and there would be more challenges, more resistance, but she was making progress, one step at a time. And that was enough to keep her going. At home, Emma continued to be a source of strength and support, helping Dana navigate the ups and downs of her work, providing a safe space where she could relax and recharge. They spent their evenings together, talking about their days, cooking dinner, watching movies, and finding small moments of joy in the midst of the chaos. One night, after a particularly long day, Dana came home to find that Emma had set up a surprise for her. The living room was filled with candles, soft music playing in the background, and a delicious meal waiting on the table. "What's all this?" Dana asked, a smile breaking across her face as she took in the scene. Emma grinned, pulling her into a hug. "You've been working so hard, and I wanted to do something special for you. You deserve it." Dana felt a rush of gratitude and love as she looked at Emma, her heart swelling with emotion. "You're amazing, you know that?" Emma laughed, kissing her softly on the lips. "And don't you forget it." They spent the evening together, talking, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. For a few hours, Dana allowed herself to forget about the pressures of work, the challenges that lay ahead, and simply be present in the moment. As they sat on the couch later that night, watching a movie, Dana rested her head on Emma's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace that had been elusive in recent weeks. "I couldn't do this without you," Dana said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. Emma stroked her hair gently, her voice warm and reassuring. "And you'll never have to. I'm with you every step of the way." Dana closed her eyes, letting the comfort of Emma's words wash over her. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the fight for change was far from over. But she also knew that she wasn't alone in that fight. She had allies, supporters, people who believed in her and in the work she was doing. And with them by her side, she knew she could face whatever challenges came her way. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the reforms Dana had fought for began to take root within the department. The new training programs were rolled out, officers began to adapt to the revised protocols, and the Independent Oversight Committee started its work. There were still moments of resistance, still challenges to overcome, but Dana remained steadfast in her commitment to seeing the changes through. She knew that true reform was a long and difficult process, one that required persistence, resilience, and the willingness to keep pushing forward, even when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. But as she looked back on everything that had happened, from the moment of her wrongful arrest to the press conference, the negotiations, and the implementation of the reforms, Dana felt a deep sense of pride. She had stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. She had used her position, her influence, to make a real difference. And she knew that the work wasn't over. It would never be over, as long as there were still injustices to fight, still wrongs to right. But she was ready for that fight, ready to continue the work she had started. Because that was who Dana Wells was, a fighter, a leader, and a woman who would never stop striving for a better, more just world. And with the support of her loved ones, her colleagues, and her community, she knew that she could make that world a reality.